Imagine a war so brutal. It consumes nearly 500,000 lives on one side alone, the bloodiest conflict in its entire history. Now imagine that whole catastrophe. It could have been avoided, not by some grand peace treaty, but by just one leader in one room making a better choice. How does a small regional land dispute escalate so fast and so completely into a total war of annihilation?
And that, right there, is a paradox we're diving into today. We're looking at the lead up to the Battle of Changping in 260 BCE. Now, it's often framed as this huge military disaster, but it's really a story about diplomatic blunders, strategic survival, and the incredible cost of letting pure, irrational rage take over.
And this deep dive is really for you, the learner, to get a handle on the mechanics of it, to see how greed and panic and some just masterful information warfare paved the road to this historic clash. We're talking about the rising aggressive state of Qin and his powerful neighbor ZHAO. Our mission here is to unpack that critical sequence of decisions that turned what should have been a simple land transfer into, well, an existential crisis.
The stage is set in 260 BCE, the 55th year of King Nan of Zhao's reign. And the figures are, they're just staggering. We're talking about combined forces probably totaling around 1 million troops massing in the Central Plains. But the spark that lit this whole fire wasn't a king's grand declaration of war. It was all about the fate of one seemingly small but incredibly vital region, a place called the Shandong Commandery.
Okay, so we have to start with the big picture, the strategic backdrop here. Qin is this rising power, and they're just relentless. They're targeting the state of Han. Their best general, Bai Qi, is systematically taking Han apart, piece by piece.
Right. And Han knows the writing is on the wall. They recognize they're beaten, so they decide on a painful but, seemingly rational option.
Yeah.
They'll just cede the Shandong Commandery to Qin to buy themselves some peace.
A done deal, basically. Surgical transfer of land.
It was supposed to be. Han gives up the land, Qin expands, Han gets to survive, and the grand strategy of Qin's chief minister, Fan Sui, just keeps rolling on. His plan was famous, right? Befriend the distant and attack the near.
Yeah.
So they'd absorb nearby states like Han and Wei and keep the bigger powers like Zhao off balance for a later fight.
But this entire brilliant long-term strategy is about to get completely derailed. And not by a king or a general, but by a mid-level bureaucrat.
Exactly. This is the moment of the perfect diplomatic ambush. So Han appoints a new governor for Shandong, a man named Feng Ting. His job is simple: hand the keys to Qin. But Feng Ting, whether it's out of patriotism or defiance or maybe just fear of Qin's legendary brutality, he unilaterally decides to offer the land and all its people not to Qin, but to their biggest rival, Zhao.
That is just an incredible act of defiance. He didn't just complicate things. He basically threw a hand grenade into the whole geopolitical timeline.
Right.
How could one local official just override a state-level command like that?
Well, it tells you a lot about the fragile authority at the time, especially in these commanderies that were far from the capital. Feng Ting knew the people in Shandong would much rather be ruled by Zhao than by Qin. I mean, Qin was notoriously brutal to newly conquered people. So by offering the land to Zhao, he does two things. He saves his own skin, and he gets his people let's say, a slightly softer landlord.
And this move instantly drags Han back into the mess. And it lets them, conveniently claim they're innocent later on.
And the land itself, that was the real prize. Shandong was geographically vital. It bordered Zhao directly. It was their essential western buffer zone. Crucially, it also controlled major trade routes and mountain passes. If Qin occupies it, that buffer just vanishes. And Qin gets this perfect, uncontested staging ground to march right on Zhao's capital, Handan.
So if Qin takes Shandong, the cost for Zhao to defend itself later just skyrockets. This wasn't just losing a strip of land. It was like losing the only lock on their front door.
That's the crux of it. That is the Shandong paradox. Zhao is suddenly staring at a choice with no easy answers. They can either accept this windfall and instantly provoke an enraged Qin, or they can refuse the gift and just hand their critical defensive shield over to their greatest enemy without a fight. Either way, they're choosing conflict.
And this decision just splits the court of King Shaocheng of Zhao right down the middle. It's the classic high-stakes political debate. So let's break down the two arguments here.
Okay, so on one side you have Lord Pingyang. He's the voice of caution, and his analysis was incredibly sharp. He argued that Feng Ting's offer was obviously a trap. He called it a trouble-shifting plot. His warning was, look, Zhao should not covet this small immediate gain if it means suffering massive long-term losses by provoking Qin directly. It messes up the whole timeline.
Right. Pinyan saw that Feng Ting was trying to use Zhao as a human shield against Qin. He's just trying to transfer the problem, not the asset.
Precisely. Pingyang understood the psychological cost. Zhao would get the territory, sure, but they would also absorb all of Qin's focused, white-hot fury. The risk, in his view, just dwarfed the reward.
But then you have the other voice, Lord Pingyuan, who sees nothing but opportunity. He calls Shandong an enormous fortune, a prize that's just too valuable to pass up. He sort of downplays the strategic risk, arguing that getting that defensive advantage was worth whatever fight was coming.
And historically, Lord Pingyuan gets hammered for this. Historians like Sima Qian basically say he was blinded by pure greed. And, well, we know how it ends. Zhao took the land, they gave Fengting titles, and they paid a catastrophic price.
But let's push back on that a bit. The standard view is that Pingyuan was just greedy. But if we look at the strategic reality, the fact that they were about to lose their western buffer zone, was his choice really just reckless greed? Or was it more of a panicked defensive maneuver?
I think this is where we have to apply strategic thinking over simple moral judgment. Zhao knew Qin was coming for them. Eventually. Fan Sui's entire plan guaranteed it. So by accepting Shandong, Zhao forces Qin to fight the war on the frontier, far from their capital. If they had refused the land, Qin would have just walked in, occupied it peacefully, and then spent a year building up supply depots right on Zhao's border.
So it was a choice between a hard fight now, on ground that's good for them, or an impossible fight later, on ground that's catastrophic for them.
Exactly. From a pure state survival perspective, it was a desperate gamble to gain a crucial defensive foothold. They were trying to manage an inevitable invasion. You have to remember, if Qin got Shandong peacefully, they could have used its population, maybe several 100,000 people, and its vital iron ore resources to make their military machine even stronger.
And by taking the land, Zhao denies Qin those resources and forces their hand. This makes the label of just grade feel way too simple, doesn't it? It sounds like Pingyuan was thinking about national defense, not personal gain, however risky that defense turned out to be.
It really shows a misunderstanding of how risk assessment works in wartime. Lord Pingyang was afraid of the immediate cost of poking the bear. Lord Pingyang was afraid of the ultimate existential cost of just letting the bear set up a permanent camp right outside his front door.
It sounds like one of those impossible situations where both sides of the argument were, in a way, correct. Zhao chose the path of confrontation, hoping to delay the inevitable, but really, they just hit the fast-forward button.
And that acceleration was the most dangerous part. They weren't ready to fight Qin's main army yet. They gambled that Qin's anger wouldn't immediately short-circuit their rational long-term plan, and they gambled wrong.
And I think that brings us to a core insight here. Sometimes what looks like simple greed is actually a panicked defensive maneuver aimed at staving off inevitable annihilation. That one choice sealed their fate.
So now we have to pivot and look at this from Qin's perspective, because their reaction is what dictated the absolute ferocity of this war. Fengting's move didn't just annoy them, it strategically humiliated them.
The moment Fengting flipped the territory, Qin's entire court must have been in just total shock. Zhao, of course, is celebrating this incredible windfall, and Han is doing this little diplomatic dance, shrugging their shoulders and saying, "Oh, our subordinates are so unruly," and just conveniently blaming Zhao.
Qin was incandescent is the word. Remember Fan Sui's blueprint? They had spent years patiently carving up Han, avoiding a direct fight with Zhao, making sure that when they did strike Zhao, it would be isolated and strategically weak.
They had already cut Shandong off from Han's other territories. They had the supply lines ready for an easy annexation. They were expecting what? A simple administrative handover?
Minimal resistance. But overnight, they lost not just the territory, but the ease of the victory. They went from planning a surgical, low-cost win to being forced into this costly, high-risk, head-on collision with Zhao, the very power they had planned to isolate for years. All that elaborate planning, the investment in logistics, all of it was just shredded by one local governor's decision.
And the geography of it made Zhao's new possession really strong. Shandong and Zhao shared a perfect long border. The text says they blended like water and milk, which I guess means Zhao can just instantly integrate the population and resources.
Making it almost impossible for Qin to take the territory back without a full-scale invasion. This is a devastating diplomatic ambush. Let's use that modern corporate parallel because it really gets at the depth of the betrayal Qin must have felt.
Okay, let's do it. So imagine this massive tech conglomerate, Qin Inc., has been meticulously planning a hostile takeover of a key parts supplier, Hancore. They spend 2 years buying up subsidiaries, clearing regulatory hurdles, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. They are minutes away from signing the final papers. They're expecting an effortless acquisition that will secure their supply chain for the next decade. And then the manager of the most vital factory, Shandong, not only refuses the deal, but flips the entire factory, all its patents, all its key talent, to Qin's bitterest rival, ZHAO Inc., overnight, for free.
The cost isn't just the factory itself. It's the monumental loss of strategic time, capital, and credibility. That level of frustration. It demands an immediate public smackdown, regardless of the quarterly budget.
Yes, Qin felt strategically violated. Their entire rational step-by-step expansion plan was in ruins. This demanded an immediate, overwhelming response to save face and prove that nobody, especially not ZHAO, could hijack their destiny.
And the sources show that Han just played this perfectly.
Yeah.
They immediately shift the blame. They go to Qin and say, look, we were all set to give you Shandong, but ZHAO acted dishonorably and just seized it from us.
And that rhetoric was perfectly calculated to light a fire under King Zhaoshang of Qin. To him, this wasn't just politics anymore. This was a personal insult to his state's military dignity.
So when the king heard this report, he just flew into a rage. He completely bypassed his strategic advisors and immediately ordered a massive military mobilization against ZHAO.
And this is the critical moment of irrationality. Strategically, Qin should have waited. They should have finished consolidating Han or focused on Wei like Fan Sui had originally planned. ZHAO was supposed to be years down the road. But the emotional reaction, that burning need to vent their humiliated rage, it just trumped all rational strategy.
So you're seeing a choice made purely from impulse. ZHAO was driven by this opportunistic desire. And Qin was driven by pure vengeful fury, a need for immediate bloody payback for a diplomatic insult.
And that distinction is everything. Opportunism.
Yeah.
You can forgive that if it's backed by strength, but humiliated rage is blind. It dictates that the opponent must be crushed immediately and completely, even if it messes up your own long-term plan. This is where the annihilation factor comes in. Qin wasn't fighting for land anymore. They were fighting for revenge.
And what about the people at the center of all this, the residents of Shandong?
Their will to fight against Qin, which was initially pretty strong, it collapsed almost as soon as King Xiaocheng of ZHAO offered them titles in gold. Think about it. When they were isolated, they were desperate defenders with their backs to the wall. But once they were integrated into ZHAO, they became favored subjects. They were looking for a comfortable life under a powerful new backer.
Wait, I don't get that. If they were favored, wouldn't they be more loyal and fight harder for their new protector, ZHAO?
You'd think so, but the offer of titles in gold basically bought them off. It signaled that their survival was no longer in question. Their status was elevated. So their focus shifted from active, desperate defense to passively enjoying their new privileges. They became a privileged population, not a hardened military garrison.
So ZHAO's big political win, the seamless water and milk integration, actually had this subtle but pretty profound military weakness built right into it. They inherited a population that was suddenly softer, less motivated to defend their new home against Qin's professional, vengeful armies.
Exactly. The Qin army, driven by rage, was hard as steel. The ZHAO defense, relying on this newly acquired, softened population, was structurally vulnerable from day one. The fuse was lit, the battle lines were drawn at Changping, and the stage was set for diplomatic blunders to make a bad military situation 1,000 times worse.
Okay, so the war begins. Qin launches this immediate counterattack led by General Wang He. He quickly attacks and captures Shandong just like they wanted. But the key part is he doesn't stop. He pursues the refugees right up to ZHAO's main defensive line at Changping.
And ZHAO's general, Liang Po, he stations his army there to shelter this huge flood of people, but Qin's pursuit is just relentless. ZHAO suffers defeat after defeat right away. They lose key outposts, high-ranking officers, a deputy general, 4 commanders, gone in a flash. Lord Pingyang's warning from before was coming true in the worst possible way. The immediate cost was devastating.
So ZHAO is in a full-blown crisis. The reality of Qin's military power and their furious commitment has just hit them like a tidal wave. They desperately need peace, but seeking peace from an enemy who is winning and wants revenge, that requires flawless diplomatic skill.
And this is where the mistakes go from being, strategically reckless to just sheer diplomatic catastrophe. King Xiaocheng is completely overwhelmed by the defeats, and he consults his top 2 ministers, Lo Chang and the brilliant strategist, Yu Qing.
Let's really dig into this debate because it's such a clear, timeless clash between two different ways of thinking about foreign policy. You got the immediate, comforting solution versus the difficult, high-stakes bluff.
Right. So Lo Chang, he advocates for the simple, direct approach. He says, send a prominent senior envoy, a high nobleman, straight to Qin's capital. The idea is to show Zhao is sincere about peace, they're humble, they're ready to talk.
It's the diplomatic version of waving a white flag and just asking for terms, hoping Qin is cooled off enough to listen.
But Yu Qing, who is a true master of strategic psychology, he sees the fatal flaw in that. He argues that Qin is fully determined to destroy Zhao. There's no negotiating. He knows direct talks will either be rejected outright or worse, they'll be exploited.
So what was Yu Qing's plan, the psychological operation, the high-stakes bluff?
His proposal was audacious. Instead of going to Qin, he said Zhao should take its massive state treasures, gold, fine silks, artifacts, and send envoys loaded with these gifts to the courts of Chu and Wei, two other powerful states.
But why Chu and Wei? They were famously reluctant to get involved in other states' fights, and Qin was way too strong for them to challenge openly. What was the point of just sending them treasure?
The treasure was just the prop. The objective was purely psychological deterrence. Yu Qing knew getting actual troops from them was unlikely. But the sight of Zhao publicly showering Chu and Wei with wealth would instantly make Qin suspect that Zhao was forming a powerful Hizonga coalition of the willing.
The ancient equivalent of a NATO alliance forming right before their eyes.
Precisely. The fear of fighting a unified multi-front war, even a potential one, would paralyze Qin. They would be forced to divert troops to their other borders and, crucially, they'd be forced to negotiate seriously with Zhao just to break up this potential coalition before it could get off the ground.
So it wasn't about the reality of the coalition, it was about creating the perception of one, forcing Qin to completely rethink their strategy.
That is the essence of deterrence theory, developed millennia ago. Lo Chang offered a simple, immediate comfort blanket. Yu Qing offered a difficult, indirect strategy based on manufacturing fear, and it was the only plan that had any chance of stopping the annihilation.
And this is where the human element just fails. King Xiaozhong is under intense, immediate psychological pressure. Defeats are mounting, refugees are flooding in, the cost is astronomical.
People under that kind of extreme stress, they tend to choose the immediate, visible action that gives them a little bit of psychological relief, even if that action is strategically disastrous. The high-stakes bluff Yu Qing was proposing, it required patience, it required risk tolerance, things that the king just didn't have in that moment of pure anxiety.
He just wanted the problem to go away now. So he chose the direct, simple solution. Lo Chang's option. He sends a high nobleman, Zheng Zhou, directly to Qin to sue for peace. He's clinging to that temporary relief of having done something.
It was a catastrophic failure of leadership under duress. The king literally traded strategic foresight for immediate comfort. The consequences, though, weren't immediately obvious. In fact, the king was actually optimistic at first.
He was, because Qin received Zheng Zhou with full honors. He rushes back to Yu Qing saying, "See, Qin received Zheng Zhou, we have peace."
And Yu Qing's response was just devastatingly prophetic. He basically told the king that Qin receiving the envoy wasn't diplomacy, it was a trap. He predicted Zhao would fail and suffer a total crushing defeat.
And here is where Qin proves just how brilliant they are. They don't just accept Zheng Zhou, they execute a masterclass in ancient information warfare. They turn the simple act of receiving an envoy into a devastating weapon.
Right. At that exact time, envoys from all the other feudal states were already gathered in Qin's capital, congratulating Qin on its recent victories. The whole world was watching.
So when Zheng Zhou, this high nobleman from Zhao, arrives, Qin gives him this unprecedented public honor and generous treatment. Why? Why go to all that trouble for an enemy envoy who's begging for peace?
It was a message, a clear, devastating message broadcast to the entire region. By honoring Zheng Zhou with so much pomp and circumstance, Qin was loudly announcing to everyone, Zhao has sued for peace, the war is over, there's no need for anyone to get involved, go home.
This completely neutralized the very threat Yu Qing was trying to create. The other states see Zhao's envoy being treated like royalty, and they think, oh, okay, the crisis is over, Zhao is handling it, they're not going to form a coalition.
Qin pulled off a propaganda coup. They publicly accepted the overture of peace, using Zheng Zhou's high status for maximum effect, while at the same time, they refused any actual peace talks and intensified their attacks on the front line at Changping.
So they get the political credit for looking reasonable, while securing the military advantage of completely isolating their enemy. Zhao, who was already isolated militarily, was now totally isolated diplomatically by Qin's masterful manipulation of perception.
And the final proof of the strategy came right after. Once they knew Zhao was diplomatically alone, Qin replaced General Wang He with their supreme commander, the butcher Bai Qi. That was the signal they were moving from simple victory to total annihilation. They knew Zhao stood completely and utterly alone. The stage was set for the bloodiest battle in history, and it was sealed not by a sword, but by a diplomatic misstep fueled by anxiety. #outro.
So when we look back at it, we've seen how strategic necessity drove Zhao to accept a territory they just couldn't hold. And then how humiliated rage drove Qin to attack immediately, completely overriding their own careful strategic timetable. The escalation from a simple land swap to total war was driven almost entirely by these emotional, psychological pressures.
But the truly decisive mistake, it was Zhao's diplomatic failure. King Xiaocheng's refusal to execute that high-stakes deterrence bluff that Yu Qing proposed. His need for the immediate comfort of simple diplomacy, it cost them any chance they had of getting outside help. And Qin just brilliantly leveraged that weakness, turning a routine diplomatic reception into a tool of devastating isolation.
Qin makes sure that when the final military showdown came, it would be a one-on-one fight against an enemy with no allies. It guaranteed the outcome. They proved that psychological warfare, information control, it's often more decisive than armor and arrows.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture today, when our leaders face overwhelming immediate pressure, how often do they still choose that immediate visible action? The one that calms the nerves in the short term over the superior but difficult and high-stakes psychological strategy. Is that instinct to just relieve anxiety still the single greatest, most exploitable weakness in diplomacy today?
The Battle of Changping proved that sometimes the greatest failures, the ones that lead to mass slaughter, they don't happen on the battlefield with the clash of armies. They happen in the anxious, quiet decision-making rooms of power, where fear triumphs over foresight. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.